Good morning, this is Sergeant Troy Sterling, Lake Havasu City Police Department, Public Information Officer. I want to report on Monday, July 22nd at around 9:19 a.m. Officers responded to the 2600 block of North Smoketree Avenue after a 911 call was received from a construction worker. And what had happened is the construction worker was under the impression that one of his co-workers had a gun pointed at him from a neighbor in the area, and that neighbor had also apparently fired off a round into the air. Ultimately, the responding officers set up a perimeter once the subject at that residence refused commands from the initial responding officer, and he went back inside his residence. Perimeter was established by the officers responding. Phone contact was made by one of the officers that was a negotiator at the scene, and the resident was identified as David King, age 55 at that time. Ultimately, the man refused to come out of the residence. Negotiation team was called out. The SWAT team was called out. The SWAT team took over the perimeter duties, while officers also stayed in the area as additional perimeter units. Negotiation team dealt with Mr. King for approximately 5 hours, and at which time Mr. King ultimately surrendered and came out of the residence at that time. Mr. King was taken into custody at approximately 1:50 p.m. that afternoon. Additional officers had also been called in during this incident to help cover calls for service on the street. And due to the hot and humid day that it was, the CERT and the rehab fire department truck responded to the scene to assist with rehab for officers in the area having to deal with that hot and humid day. The street department was a great assistance. They came out, provided cones and barricades for closure of surrounding streets during the incident. And then ultimately, Criminal Investigations Bureau was called in after Mr. King was taken into custody to conduct a search warrant of the residence. And during that search warrant, they were able to recover several guns and ammunition that they seized and brought back to the police department as evidence. Mr. King ultimately was brought to the police department. His intoxication level was very high, so he was taken to the emergency room to be medically cleared before he could be brought back and ultimately booked into jail. The charges that Mr. King received was aggravated assault, disorderly conduct with a weapon, and he'd also disobeyed a court order, so he was charged with that accordingly. Ultimately, the officers at the scene, with the conditions, a lot of them came back sunburned, very dehydrated, and the chief of police responded to the scene, and his overall impression was a very good job had by all. Nobody was injured during the incident, and Mr. King was taken into custody without incident.